thing that that was different from previous books of Nietzsche. Like I went ahead and read Twilight of the Idols, and like I think that that was like Nietzsche at his like Nietzscheist. But compared to Beyond Good and Evil, and especially The Birth of Tragedy, how did like the gay signs compare? If you guys have it still fresh in your mind from when we read Beyond Good and Evil. And I mean, listen, Will and Nicholas. By the way, here we have Henry, we have Nicholas, we have Will. Those Henry and Will, they went ahead and read The Birth of Tragedy. I tried to read it, but I just didn't really like it that much. But compared to like the gay science, how do you guys think it like compares as far as like?
Well, Nietzsche was a lot less of a simp in the gay science than in the Birth of Tragedy. He wasn't simping for Wagner and stuff. Also, like a lot of his anti-Semitism came out in the gay science.
But I think that, I think that the most important difference between the gay science and other books we've read, like the Genealogy of Morals, Birth of Tragedy, and even we have tackled those books, Zarathustra, sometimes. I think the major difference with this book is the aphorism format, in that you don't know what topic he's going to start now, and when he starts it, you don't know when it's going to end. Like, it just jumps from one thing to another.
Oh, yeah, it's like Birth of Tragedy was really focused. We also read the Genealogy of Morality. Genealogy of Morality was like Nietzsche is closest to like an analytical philosopher, and this one is like him just bouncing between different topics a lot.
Okay.
Yeah, so this was going to be Nietzsche. This was written right before Zarathustra, and typically that's how Nietzsche structures his own life, as kind of this like before and after his Zarathustra moment. So this is Nietzsche kind of after he has rejected German idealism, and he's starting to he's like right before coming upon his own system at this point.
Right.
He has a lot of critiques, he has an idea of where he's going, but he hasn't yet achieved what he wants to do.
Yeah, I mean, like he's still in his process of breaking off from. I mean, I guess he has broken off from Schopenhauer long before this already. But like in The Birth of Tragedy, he's still like very much Schopenhauerian, and like Deleuze was talking about this. He still retains like kind of like the dialectic in how he presents like Apollo versus Dionysus and such, and so he's still very much involved in that. But I don't know, maybe it was just like the art heavy themes and like just so many references to like all sorts of like obscure German plays. I was like, man, can I just read like?
I mean, that's something I experienced a lot with Birth of Tragedy, that at the beginning Nietzsche is going to reference all these ancient Greek plays, most of which I'm not really familiar with. But I think Birth of Tragedy still has a lot of value, even if you don't really understand what those plays are, or if you haven't experienced them before. Later on in the book, it gets into a critique of ancient Greek philosophy, but it's still related to his views on ancient Greek art.
Right, and like I guess okay, so we have the difference between The Birth of Tragedy and like not genealogy, the gay science is he has this big breakaway with the Dionysian concept where it's like the Dionysian concept is no longer in opposition to the Apollonian. It's instead an opposition to
romanticism. There was the Dionysian and romanticism, and I guess resentment probably comes with romanticism, but it was like that was the distinction: romanticism and Dionysianism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think he from then on, I don't know if he like does another evolution in this concept, but I know in Twilight of the Idols, he very much carries on with that notion. It's like in the middle of the gay science, is like, wait a second. And then suddenly he's like, yeah, he rolls with it for the rest of his works. I haven't read The Antichrist yet, but maybe in the future I'll hit that one as well. But the Dionysian concept. But what do you guys think of his, master versus slave morality? Anything?
Oh, hey, what's the chronology on this? Genealogy and Morality came out after this, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, as for like, so the thing about like the master-slave morality, like this stems from, okay, so like the will to power. So for him, the will to power can either be like affirmative or it can be like negative. It can be resentment versus like affirmative, which is like expansion and growth and difference and such. And Nietzsche, he does this breakaway. I think it may actually be in Twilight of the Idols where he coins the term. It's called symptomatology. Philosophy becomes symptomatology, and that's where instead of analyzing the world according to like essence and appearance, he instead analyzes it like in relation to the body. And like Nietzsche's the great doctor, and so you have like affirmation, which is like healthy, and you have like negation, which is unhealthy and like decadent and sick. And so you have philosophy, which like springs from these different types of bodies. Instead of the world being determined, it's more of like what composition are you, and what sort of philosophy does
he
it
got
give rise?
real materialistic on this.
He
and
did.
Kind of thought like, okay, maybe people's diets are affecting what philosophical systems they're coming up with, and why some are more pessimistic than others.
He does. Okay, so
I think there was also some racism in that discussion about like Chinese people and rice.
So he's going to have that materialism sometimes in which he tries to pathologize certain moral groups which he disagrees with. But then there's other times in which he mentions you need to have a healthy spirit or a healthy soul.
Right.
So I don't think he's quite purely materialistic.
I think I would agree. Like sometimes it's like, okay, he has this entire thing about vegetarianism, so like aphorism 145 and like several others, but it's like it speaks of like a weak constitution. But I think that really feeds into what he's trying to do with like the idea of philosophy as the body, and like what is your composition? Is it, he associates vegetarianism.
Okay, so I think the main thing here is that he might be wrong on the diet thing, but I think like his whole point was like kind of like more like, okay, let's look for physical causes of the ideas that people are coming up with. I think that was the main idea. So like he might have been wrong about diets causing it. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, like the thing about like forces and will to power is like forces are like the driving. The will is what underlies, and it can be affirmative or it can be negative. But in any sense, force. I've always like thought about this in relation to like a battery and voltage and current. It's where there's like a negative side of the battery versus a positive, and like forces are like, it's like the current. But that may be a bad analogy, but that's how I've kind of imagined it. But as far as how it fits into like the vegetarianism thing, it's like I think one of the reasons he heavily attacks it is because there's kind of like this spirit of not wanting to step on the world. You don't want to hurt anything as you go through it. And to Nietzsche, that's very reactive. That's a reactive force instead of assertive. And so I think that's kind of the angle that he's coming at vegetarianism. And it may seem like really weird when you come up to Nietzsche's. It's like, whoa, what's this thing about like beans? It's like it fits into his entire schema of composition and will to power and forces and decadent and affirmation and repression and just a whole bunch of things.
There's this segment, I forget which book it is specifically, where he talks about like alcohol and the consumption of it, but that like the Christian ability of wanting to get rid of those things isn't control over that impulse. It's just as much following under it. Like to be a free spirit, it's not about cutting things out of your life, and like that's too much the aesthetic lifestyle.
Oh, okay. So I think I remember the distinction he makes here. So like, or maybe someone Anyway, I think this is a distinction. Like one is you go on a diet such that you can win a race or something. Like I guess that would have to do maybe with like alcohol. Maybe like you want to I don't know, build something and you can't be like drinking alcohol all the time because you won't be able to. Nah, screw that. Let's go with candy. There we go. You're not eating a lot of candy because candy will make you fat, and then you won't be able to win races because you'll be too fat. Whereas instead, there's candy. I'm not going to have any candy. Candy's a bad thing. I'm not going to have any candy ever again, and you're just like kind of denying candy, without like a thing you're trying to do with that.
Yeah.
So it's like so it's like trying to get rid of something versus moving towards something. I think that's the difference here.
Yeah.
So being aesthetic for like instrumental reasons to like achieve a goal is fine on his watch, but being aesthetic for the case of just renouncing things is bad.
Yeah, I mean, he has this thing about, I think this is the big thing he has against the Stoics primarily, even though in some places, like with Nietzsche, it's always complicated. It's like on one hand, I'm like the last Stoic, but, and so it's really complicated in that sense. But the thing he has against like the Stoics is that they want to castrate themselves in such a way to where they don't have to feel pain or pleasure, because pain and pleasure are so intimately tied together that you can't have one without the other. And so for that's the reason why he has this sense of displeasure against the Stoics, is because they want to castrate themselves, they want to separate themselves from the world, they don't want to feel pain, and so they can't experience pleasure. And so the aesthetic ideal.
Yeah, and there's this kind of general idea. I think this is in Beyond Good and Evil, when he's saying that the Stoics have this view of the world where they say that there's these things outside of you that you can't control. Mm-hmm. And those are the things you need to try to remove from yourself, and you need to focus on kind of the world that you are. And Nietzsche's point is that those two things are connected. They're the same thing. The world as you perceive it is also the outside world. So the Stoic division of trying to say focus on the individual and not the world outside of you fails because they're one of the same.
And I guess that's one of the reasons why his famous saying, amorphity, let that be my...
Is this kind of like what you're saying is like the individual isn't even there if there isn't an external world? I mean, like if you just have like a brain that's just, a Boltzmann brain or something, and there's like nothing else there. It's like there's no individual really, because like it's not interacting with anything. Like we're to exist is to be interacting with the external world. Is that kind of more?
Yeah, but also that your lens of the world is a part of your own creation in the first place, right? In that, because the Stoics see that there's these things outside of my control which are impacting me, which I need to limit. But Nietzsche's point is that your perception of those things is a thing that you created yourself anyhow.
So 2 things in connection to that. So Joey mentioned that the Stoics castrate themselves because they are trying to experience neither pleasure nor pain. Mm-hmm. I think aphorism 12 is especially relevant here because it talks about the ultimate goal of science. And
yes.
We usually have the common perception that science is here to create the most pleasure for us and to reduce the most pain for us. But Nietzsche is going to argue that you only have 2 options. You either have no pleasure and no pain, or that you have a lot of pleasure but also a lot of pain accompanied by that. Mm-hmm. So that would be in relation to the Stoics. Stoics? Yeah. But in relation to how the Stoics also see this division of the world, that there is your world of control and the world outside of you that you cannot control. I think that relates to the phrase Nietzsche used in this book.
Was it amorphity?
No, in this book, Gay Science, he said something like, there is no reality for us.
I think this might actually be the connection here, because one thing would be ridiculous. So like, if you increase the amount of pleasure, that requires an increasing of the suffering. And then if you decrease the amount of suffering, that requires a decrease of the amount of pleasure to some extent. But I'm thinking that it's not. I'm thinking it's more like, because I think there's ways that. Oh, okay. I think I get it here. So actually, get rid of this one, just this. If you increase the amount of pleasure, you have to increase the suffering in some way. I don't think it works the other way around.
Why not?
Well, because I think it's like a thing where like some suffering is necessary for pleasure, but some of it is just suffering and doesn't bring any pleasure.
Yeah.
So it would be like you have to suffer to have pleasure, but you don't have to have pleasure to suffer.
Can you say that again?
You have to have suffering to have pleasure, but you don't have to have pleasure to have suffering. So like you can suffer without feeling any pleasure, but you can't feel pleasure without suffering. I think that would be the way that things would be going here. I'm not sure how he justifies this though. Like, how does he justify this viewpoint? Why can't you increase pleasure and not increase suffering to go with it?
And this, I mean, suffering is like a really big thing of what he's trying to do. It's like, it's kind of, I mean, I guess this is what the transvaluation is. It's to, and by the way, he coins that, I think he does like officially say the transvaluation in Twilight of the Idols, but it's to invert kind of this ontological value assignment of the world, which is, to say that existence is evil because it's suffering, it's hurtful. But like in 276, this is where he has the Stoic phrase. So he says this: I want to learn more and more to see as beautiful what is necessary in things. Then I shall be one of those who make things beautiful. Amor fati, let that be my love henceforth. I do not want to wage war against what is ugly. I do not want to accuse. I do not even want to accuse those who accuse. Looking away shall be my only negation. And all in all, and on the whole, someday I wish to be only a yes-sayer. And, yeah, I mean, if there's any, like, aphorism that's, that characterizes affirmation, this is definitely one of them. It's where you take existence, all of existence, in the face as it is, and it's not to cut off any portion or to limit it or constrain it to like a central point.
This kind of seems like somewhat of a tension here, like armor fati, but also like trying to increase your power. It's like power kind of has to do with control and like making so that things go how you wish it to be, whereas armor fati is like loving things as they are, regardless. I mean, I guess you could do both, but never mind. I lost my thought.
Well, no, I think you have a point there, but I think you probably could do both at the same time, because it's like, I mean, you're embracing it. You're embracing the situation in which you've been. Well, you're embracing existence in which you've been situated, which is that it's constant suffering and it's in constant war.
Is this kind of like stoicism, except you actually try to change the external world, but like after the fact, you just love whatever happens?
I think it is kind of in that sense where it's like he always has this thing about like affirmation is externalization instead of like internalization of which like the Christian and the Stoic do, because for the Christian, internalization is like repression. It's you still have like there will always be like this will to power, but instead of being able to like act upon it and like put it in and externalize it on the world, you have to internalize it into like repression. And in that case, in that way, it's kind of like it's self-laceration.
So
you have to direct the power.
It's kind of like so like Nietzsche is more advocating that you embrace the world and like kind of interact with it as much as you can, whereas like Stoicism is kind of about like separating your interaction with the world.
I think so, yeah. And I think so, whereas that's like a case of like castration, one might say. He has this, if we were to pivot a little, we would only have to pivot a little to see his critique against like utilitarianism, or I guess morality in general. It's just, it's this, you create this like central locus upon which the entire world revolves around. And he wants to like dissolve this central focus and say there's, instead of revolving around a single point, it's like expansion across the entire spectrum of values that could ever be. And I think that's actually what authenticity is. I think it's being situated, because it's inevitable. You can't escape the fact that you're situated somewhere. So I think authenticity for Nietzsche is you can't ever like separate yourself from it, but you can create away from it. You can do something like original away from what he calls like the herd or the mass. It's to expand beyond the boundaries in which you've been situated, because you can't ever separate yourself from it. And that's why we were talking about this last semester. But you were saying how he's kind of like the Ubermensch is kind of like this messianic figure for. I guess in this case though he's the anti-Christ, anti-Christ. In this way, it's yeah. I guess it is kind of like the inversion of Christ in that way. It's still like a messianic theme, but it's not in the same Christian.
Oh, so is it kind of like with his idea of the person? Is it kind of like, oh, now I should get better symbols. Okay, so B is the body, E is the external world, and P is the person. Is the person like this interaction here, like with the body and the external world? Is that kind of what Nietzsche means? So like when you separate the body from the external world, there's no person anymore because there's no interaction with the external world. That's kind of what does that make sense with what his view is here?
Well, maybe if we were to connect a few more thoughts to that, it's like his thoughts about the unconscious and like the will are very telling as like this connection between the body and the person in the world, right? So I think Nietzsche is kind of, I'm not sure whether he would fit into this category exactly, but he's epiphenomenological, in which the body is like in the world and it's like moving and stuff. But this thing that's created, this thing that we call the consciousness, is kind of like a byproduct that's created, but it has like no interaction between the body. So the consciousness is like this afterthought generation. I've always thought about it as like a music box where all the mechanisms and the handles being turned by all sorts of forces outside of it, and the music could like represent what we think of consciousness.
Oh,
it's
so
kind of like a byproduct.
This is kind of what I meant about like internal versus external. Actually, I think that even the Stoics kind of view the body as something that's external. So I guess this even goes kind of a bit further. I don't know. So I guess this isn't actually right with the picture. But if it's like I think like the idea here is that it's like the word you said, which comes as a result of the interaction with like, let's say the brain and like external factors causes consciousness to come into being. But once you take that brain and just like, put it like in like some sort of like, if you segregate it completely through magic.
That's not how Nietzsche views the emergence of consciousness, though. In Aphorism 354, The Genius of the Species, he says that consciousness arises because of the need for communication. That if you wouldn't need to communicate with other people, there would be no consciousness. And consciousness arises because you cannot do things on your own. You need help from others. But to get that help, to let others know what you need to survive or to further your own will, you need to communicate with them. And in that communication is where consciousness arises.
Okay, so what we have is kind of like this then. So this is more of the picture. So like you have the bodies of the two people, and then their interactions with one another is is consciousness. And I guess you also need the external world to be able to get there as well, because they're actually talking about something, not just each other. So I guess it would be like communication between two different people about like the external world. Consciousness enters the picture.
Perhaps, yeah, maybe. It would be nice to see that diagram.
Sure.
Here, let me take a look real quick. Yeah. Yeah, maybe. I mean, it would be interesting to see like a fully mapped out idea of like if Nietzsche were to enter into the conversation of like mind and identity. It would be kind of interesting. But I think if you were to place him, he would be, it's kind of a mouthful, but epiphenomenologist. And I think Kaufman has kind of hinted towards that as well, but I'm not sure he would fit exactly within that mold. But the thing about like consciousness and like the emergence of language. So like let's see here. You did say aphorism 354, which is on the genius of the species. Okay, I may now proceed to the surmise that consciousness has developed only under the pressure of the need for communication. That from the start it was needed and useful only between human beings, particularly between those who commanded and those who obeyed, and that it also developed only proportion to the degree of this utility. Consciousness is really only a net of communication between human beings. It is only as such that it had to develop. A solitary human being who lived like a beast of prey would not have needed it. And so I guess this really ties into like, I mean, this would really tie into like, I don't know, theories on discourse and what continental philosophers are going to do after Nietzsche, which is, you have Heidegger who creates basically like his own language when he makes this entire new like analysis of being. And the tie-in between language and consciousness is that, okay, so...
Oh yeah, so this means that this diagram isn't complete here. You have to have more shit. So you need to have this here, and then this here, and then this over here, and this here, and this over here, and there we go. Consciousness is the interaction for each person between three things.
Yeah, perhaps, maybe. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. There's an important part that was mentioned in that aphorism, which was describing like the people who are obeying versus the people who are commanding.
Right.
Which is kind of getting into this thing of power,
Yeah.
right? When Schopenhauer talks about the body and like the will and its representation, he has this idea that kind of your consciousness is just this will that is going through reality, and our identity is just constructed through like previous looking back at ourselves.
Right.
It's a post like mortem thing. But with Nietzsche, it's more of the will to power, and so it becomes almost like an action of like force towards something.
Oh, so like consciousness itself is an active force.
Yeah, well, everything's going. There is a force. There is a becoming.
And like, okay, so like this thing about like, I think we discussed this in the chat, but it was like, where. The question was whether or not like, Nietzsche needs to overcome language. And I was like, and I there was this aphorism, Nietzsche has this section in Twilight, which is called Reason and Philosophy, but it talks a lot about this. But I think Nietzsche recognizes the fact that you can't really escape language, but where we're embedded inside of language, but to escape like this, what he calls the herd and its development of consciousness and language, if you create another type of language, then you're incomprehensible to the herd, which has developed language and consciousness to survive. And it's mere survival, which is reaction. But if one were to create their own type of like system, their entire language, their entire universe, and move away, it's incomprehensible. And so it's an act of like affirmation. You're moving in certain directions. You're creating new values, new concepts, and such. And so the part of where he mentions like this, languages between those who command and those who obey, you're escaping this dynamic and you're asserting new types of power. And so Nietzsche always has this thing of power, force, will to power, and such. And it's interesting to see this interaction between consciousness and language and discourse, which, like, I don't know, I've been reading snippets of, like, Judith Butler recently, and, like, discourse and power, and those who command and those who obey, and how subjects are made when discourse is created. And that would be like Foucault, and how the subject is integrated into systems of power. I think Nietzsche, like, I think he does a really good job in this aphorism, laying out what many continental philosophers are going to do in the next, I don't know, 50, 100 years after him. What were you going to say, Will?
Oh yeah, it had to do with images.
Oh.
I think you talked about that as well. Are the images like that we like? Because like, I'd imagine the unconscious also gets visual information. Are the images that we get symbolic? Like, because like you said something about like how we need to be able to communicate things, and that consciousness only ever gives us things that can be communicated. So wouldn't that mean that language itself has images have been like translated into a communicatable form, and that like the image itself that like the unconscious gets is like something, maybe something entirely different that isn't communicatable?
Well, I think this idea of the image is really important, and yeah, it's really important. So like, I think there's this tie-in, like images are things that are like, he has this entire thing about like anthropomorphism, and all the concepts that we make are only from like a certain human perspective. Aphorism 112, which is cause and effect, it really talks about this idea of the image. Okay. He says, in every chemical process, for example, quality appears as a miracle, as ever. Also, every locomotion. Nobody has explained a push, but how could we possibly explain anything? We operate only with things that do not exist. Lines, planes, bodies, atoms, divisible time spans, divisible spaces. How would explanations be at all possible when we first turn everything into an image, our image? And this...
What section was that?
That was 112.
Okay.
This idea about the image, it really meshes well with language. The image is, it's basically like our picture of the world, and we can only express things, we can only interpret things according from this like human perspective. And so this is like what his big critique is on like cause and effect and like explanation versus discovery, is that we're only pointing things in terms of the human image. And I guess this would lead very well into this idea of language where, if we dig through language, if we categorize things correctly, then eventually we'll finally find reality through all of this language. But he's like, hey guys, you're going to keep on digging through this image, and you're just going to find more images as you dig deeper and deeper. And so I guess this is... I guess like this is the way you relate like the idea of language to like, what are we doing with metaphysics, and like
and science.
Yeah, in science,
where science is speaking its own language.
Yeah.
And so while it's going into a pursuit to figure out its own space, the problem is that that's not giving us a truth. It's giving us the science truth.
Yeah.
In this respect, I think Wittgenstein's philosophy is especially relevant. Mm-hmm. I only know the early Wittgenstein, and I may be forgetting some parts. Wittgenstein talks about the role of language, how that affects logic, how that affects how we view the world. When we talk about how we think in images, Wittgenstein talked about the pictorial form of a symbol, the pictorial form, and I'm just throwing terms here because I think it's relevant to those who are interested in researching language after Nietzsche.
Yeah.
But I forgot what I was going to say after that.
Well, yeah, the thing about science is like, let's see here. I think, I think he has like this complicated relationship with science throughout his entire work. Obviously with like the birth of tragedy, I know he's still a romantic, right? And so he thinks science is kind of like this, like over dominating force that gets in the way, or maybe it's represented by the Apollonian, in which it is like balanced with the Dionysian, and then it's like resolution is in tragedy or whatever. But later on, he has a more positive view of science as being like this truth seeker thing that will eventually like overcome itself. But then he flips back to science being like this dominating force of like, or at least in this dominating force by which people view it, which is it's going to explain everything rather than just like creating more images. So he really does have this complicated relationship with science. And I was trying to find this one passage about science. I know that in the gay science especially, he discusses it several times, but...
Do you remember any ideas or
Was it
keywords?
the sciences and ethos?
Science, yes.
You wrote that one down. It's 123.
123. Well, yeah, for that one, it's like knowledge as a mere means. He's like, I think in this aphorism, this is how I interpreted it anyway. Nietzsche has a lot of these phrases of like, God is dead. And somewhere, I think in the gay science, he says like society is dead because we can no longer be like sincere in our beliefs. Where once you realize like that there are actors on the stage, you can't take what you believe really that seriously. And so we can never really go back in time and be like this. I think he describes it as like a stone wall. You can no longer be a stone in the wall because you don't take your role seriously anymore. But I think in this aphorism 123, this is how I interpreted it when I read it. The name of it is Knowledge as More Than a Mere Means. And again, I could have interpreted this incorrectly. I was going through the book last night, just categorizing all of these two topics. But when I read it again, it struck me, it's like we have no choice but to like use like science as kind of like our lens in modern life now. You don't need to like science is pursued for its own sake, not for like the sake of knowledge anymore. I think that's what the aphorism was about. I may need to do a closer inspection though. But in this case, like I guess maybe this would be like the big science is kind of dead, capital S science, as in like this old idea of like science being pursued for knowledge and enlightenment. Section 123. Science being pursued as like kind of like this enlightenment value. But he's like, guys, science is going to be pursued because that's like the cultural lens now. It's going to go off on its own. You don't need like this big like value pusher, I guess you might say.
Oh, okay,
like
okay. So like at first, knowledge was like this instrumental aim. Now knowledge is like now knowledge becomes its own aim.
I think so. Something along those lines, yeah.
Like there was some offshoot, and now it's kind of like getting in the way of the thing it was originally pursued for, which is showing that God exists and showing all the greatness of God. Now it's actually like, no, he's not here.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing about like overcoming. I wish I had the aphorism on hand because it's really good, but somewhere he talks about like how we free spirits are using like truth as this, free spirits will pursue truth to its very end. But wait a second, truth overcomes itself, we realize. We realize what truth has been this entire time. And so the method that we free spirits have been using, we eventually have to get rid of because we pursued it to its end. We've overcame the truth. And so...
there's another relevant one for this.
That's why...
37.
30, okay. That's why Nietzsche will at times, like, you see this contradiction of where he's like, in one sense I reject like this capital T truth, but on the other I'm using it as a method to pursue. He eventually does confront this. I just wish I had the aphorism on hand. What was...
so here's 37. It's called Owing to Three Errors. So the three errors was that in motivations for science. So one era was one would understands God, wisdom, and goodness best. Two, there's an intimate connection between knowledge, morality, and happiness. And three, in science, one possesses and loves something unselfish, harmless, self-sufficient, and truly innocent. Those were the three errors that motivated science.
Yeah, and this thing about like innocence, unselfish, harmless, self-sufficient, and truly innocent. This is like he constantly has this thing. Is when I remember we had this discussion on love. He talks about God as the judge in sections 140 and 141, but he's talking about like love being, this idea that love is opposed to like egoism. But if we think back to his idea of like force and powers, nothing is neutral. Like science isn't this neutral event. This idea that we call love, this enlightenment value of like humanity and such, it can be turned upside on its head, and it can be, this is where like the herd mentality comes from as like the greatest controller of like herding people in, creating a common parlance, creating a common language, a common consciousness. This is the idea that Nietzsche has of the herd in relation to like innocence. He's like, this clean value that you proposed is actually, it's actually full of power. And this is one of the things that he has, that he's what's called like an immanent critiquist, right? He's a materialist in which he pops open the hood and he's like, wait a second, look at these values that you guys are doing. Your values are all over the place. But yeah, science.
Okay, how does he, so about the error of it being innocent, I'm not exactly sure what he's supposed to be meaning there. Like, I think the second one makes sense, like, that, the pursuit of science, they think there's like a link between knowledge, morality, and happiness, but, in actual case, like, having more knowledge can allow you to create like more weapons that can cause a lot more harm to people.
I think the innocence is in thinking that it's not like a self-sustaining system, right? Innocent as in just that it's this thing that's kind of on its own that we're looking at. But really science is its own means as well, where science is trying to perpetuate itself.
I think I
And
agree
so it's
with
not
that.
so innocent in this like, oh, it's just this like thing that we look into. It's actively a force upon us as well.
Yeah.
And it's not something like completely objective that human impulses didn't have anything to do, so it's completely pure. No, it's a human creation.
No, I think maybe what he means by why we can't say it's self-sufficient is because it needs human beings to do it, and so it has to control human beings to be able to continue functioning. I guess that's what he kind of means by it being
not
self-sufficient.
self-sufficient, but my translation says self-sufficing. So it suffices by itself. So even if humans didn't exist, there is science. Science is independent from us, right? Nietzsche's gonna say no, it isn't.
Well, yeah, because like it's not going to be done if we're not there.
Yeah.
So yeah, like, and then like, if it's an actual active force in the world, that means that it's like has to actively control people to make them continue doing scientific work.
Yeah, and also in a sense that humans gain pleasure from engaging in science, right? In engaging this pursuit of truth. It's something that is fulfilling our desires directly. And in that sense, it is one of our desires as well. And I mean, typically we don't consider our desires innocent. They're typically kind of assumed as this like debasing factor.
Yeah. I mean, again, like, will to power underlies all. Things are possessed by forces which drive in a direction, whether it's negative or affirmative. And like this book that I'm reading, Nietzsche and Philosophy by Deleuze, he has this very pithy way of saying it's like the history of a thing in general is the succession of forces which take possession of it and the coexistence of the forces which struggle for possession. The same object, the same phenomenon, changes sense, he means like force, depending on the force which appropriates it. And it's like for like discussions of like this would apply to like, we see so many things as just like being neutral, like take technology for instance. There's like an idea of like technology being like just this mere like it's instrumental, it's this dormant object, but objects themselves are are forces themselves, and we exert forces in different ways, and so things are not just simply neutral.
Yeah, and then
Innocent.
there are always forces trying to take over. Because I had read that book, The Anxiety of Influence, sort of thing, and I've been trying to like work on an analogy for that concept to explain pretty well. And I think I've come up with one where like Lord of the Rings, how like that their depiction of like elves and goblins is very popular.
Yeah.
In fact, it's become so popular that it like after the fact overrides our conceptions of those things before Lord of the Rings. If you were to look at a story of elves that was written in the 1300s in the modern day, you're going to have that more modern view of it.
Yeah.
It's not this innocent thing, it's you're corrupting it with the modern view as well. And so in a certain sense, some of these forces will overtake our understanding of something retroactively as well.
Yeah, that's good. I was just looking here. Women, am I right?
Why women? How did
Women.
that jump happen?
Well,
We're going down the list of the categories.
I see.
women sections. Man, he wrote so many. 59 through 75 is just Nietzsche going off on women.
Do you agree with any aphorisms on women?
Well, you know what? I think like just being.
Maybe we should just avoid this. Let's go do something
Perhaps,
else.
yeah. I don't think it's...
Yeah, we're avoiding this.
No,
On to a different topic.
I think that there's like I don't know. It would be interesting to see like if there's any tie-ins between like I don't think we can like just separate this from the rest of what he says. Obviously I disagree with him, but the thing is like
Which one did he start talking about women?
59. It's
Oh,
59
yeah.
through 75. It's like I have to be honest. I glanced by these aphorisms because when it just went, women are like, I think it would be interesting to go back and take a closer look at these and see how they compare.
My general opinion on what Nietzsche's trying to say about the different sexes in general is that he has this idea that there is kind of this male nature and this female nature, and that they're both striving to become something. And in a certain sense, that both of these people should strive towards that sort of nature, right? And that any sort of prescription that says that, a man ought to act more like this or a woman ought to act more like this is kind of a perversion. It's going against the way that things should be.
I see.
Wait, should.
Yeah, should. That's kind of the difficult thing. And this is where Nietzsche at the time kind of goes against a lot of the... he wasn't a feminist, to say the least, in that his critique of, like, I think this is in Beyond Good and Evil, of, like, allowing women to vote, is that he thinks that it's saying that, like, well, this is saying that women ought to be more like men, which isn't something that we should say. Women ought to be more like women. They should love themselves more, which is a nice sentiment, but ultimately a bit politically skeptical, right?
Right.
And that it's to say that like voting or something is a nature of a man or a woman seems a bit bizarre in the first place.
And I really think that I think that's one of the big hiccups for Nietzsche.
Actually, the first one could actually just be gender neutral, actually. The 59 could actually just be read somewhat gender neutrally, I guess. But, yeah.
Well, I mean, I was going to build off from what Henry was saying. It's like again, his entire thing is about, like, composition of what you are. And, his illustration of how, like, the hawk and... I forget what it is that the hawk is preying on. But he's like, the prey looks back on the hawk and says, why are you the way you are? And it's like the hawk has no reason, like the hawk just is. That's what the hawk is composed of. And I think Henry, you're onto something. Like when that's how he's imagining it. Like the women. There's like an essential like women composition that's striving towards something, and there's a man, and I guess what he would say about like democracy and modernity is that they're trying to crush it into one common thing, one nature. Yeah, yeah.
In connection, Henry, to what you said before, that the perceptions of the concepts we have today retroactively impact the concepts from before. It's true that from the modern conception, Nietzsche isn't precisely a feminist guy. I agree with that. But even in his time, what was like in his time to talk about women, or what did people think about women back then? There is a really good aphorism 68, will and willingness. I think that depicts women in more of a positive light, even more positive, I would say, than people would have had in that time.
Yeah, I mean, generally, Nietzsche did have positive views of women in that he thought that they were intelligent people. He was one of the professors at, I think it was Leipzig University, to vote to let women in for education reasons. But he was explicitly against them voting as well. So he has like a mixed, he has his own kind of view on these sorts of things. It's interesting. I'm not sure if it's necessarily something you should take as dogma.
I think he so like here, may I read the aphorism real quick that you just mentioned? Right. So, will and willingness, section 68. Someone took a youth to a sage and said, "Look, he is being corrupted by women." The sage shook his head and smiled. "It is men," said he, "that corrupt women. And all the failings of women should be atoned by and improved in men. For it is man who creates for himself the image of woman, and woman forms herself according to this image. You are too kind-hearted about women," said one of these present. You do not know them." The sage replied, "Will is the manner of men, willingness that of women. That is the law of the sexes, truly a hard law for women. All of humanity is innocent of its existence, but women are doubly innocent. Who could have oil and kindness enough for them?" "Damn oil, damn kindness," someone else shouted out of the crowd. "Women need to be educated better. Women need to be educated better. Men need to be educated better," said the sage, and beckoned to the youth to follow him. The youth, however, did not follow him.
So there can be another problem, which is now a negative view of women, not quite positive, and it's taking responsibility away from women and saying, no, it's all men's fault. Men are corrupting women, and women are doubly innocent. They are these delicate flowers that aren't guilty of anything. So that can be negative in that sense.
On the other hand, it seems like he is conscious of this constructive view. It's
well, here it
men
seems to say that he doesn't agree with the sage. Like at the end, the youth did not follow him. I'm thinking it's kind of like saying this isn't really the correct way to look at them.
Perhaps
like they know what they're doing.
It's do you side with the sage? Does Nietzsche side with the sage or with the youth? It's like it's complicated. It would be worth going back though and seeing, tying this in with everything else that he says. But wasn't it? Maybe it wasn't genealogy. I think we discussed this last time, but he was right before he got into this entire section about
this is
women.
Beyond Good and Evil, I think.
Okay. He preferences it. He's like, okay, get ready, guys. We're about to go into this section with women. Women, am I right, boys? But
where he says that the knowledge of the sexes is an individual truth, and he's saying that my conception of women is one that I have created. That being said, this is what I think about them, sort of thing.
Yeah, and femininity and love, compassion. Nietzsche on love and compassion. It's so I think just like suffering, Nietzsche means, or he allows for compassion, but in a different way. So he says that there's this enfeebling compassion, which is where, you basically put somebody up in Rapunzel's tower and don't allow them to, you cloister them away from.
Oh, I'm just going to amend something I'm saying. I was just talking about Nietzsche's view on women. That's not my view on them.
Yeah. I mean, none of us are with Nietzsche on that point.
I don't think so.
Yeah. But he does this sometimes. He compares femininity to to like this enfeebling compassion. And I guess this would lead into kind of, what the different senses, like Nietzsche's there are two senses in which one can be compassionate. One is putting somebody up in like Rapunzel's tower, not allowing them to like face their own struggle. But the other one is where I forget exactly where he referenced it, but I think Nietzsche referenced something like this sword fight between these two foes. They're not enemies, but they are like attacking one another, like in this sword fight. And it's where one wants the other to exert themselves and
A sort of training.
yeah. And that's like the sense by which Nietzsche could mean like compassion. And I think this would follow with like pretty much many of the other, should we say Nietzsche the virtue ethicist? I would shy away from saying Nietzsche the virtue ethicist, because I think it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier. It's where like some people will like frame Nietzsche as like the aristocratic anarchist or something like that.
Which is, I think, a cool framing, but I'm not sure if you should take it as gospel.
Right. I think that's probably the way at which you would treat the phrase Nietzsche the virtue ethicist. But it's like for many of these values, you can be compassionate, but it's just not in the decadent way, is just using the terminology that Nietzsche would. But I think it was in the Gay Science here. I noted it. Let me see if I can find the aphorism, but I noted like it was very telling of Nietzsche's own psychology. It's almost like he's doing a soliloquy to the reader. It's where he's like, there's this fight within me of being compassionate to people, but at the same time, I know that to be great, I can't basically like busy myself with being compassionate and taking care of other people. It's kind of like this inner fight that Nietzsche has.
I kind of feel that way with the dog when it whines. It's like, that's my brother's responsibility, not mine. He's the one who brought a giant dog into the home without any previous notice or asking any of us that he was going to do it.
Yeah.
While you're looking for that aphorism, just kind of a note on the aphorism we just read about like the sage and the youth sort of thing. There's kind of this modern conception when it talks about desire, especially sexual desire, where there's this often within any sort of sexual desire, there's kind of the chaser and then the object of desire, right? And that the chaser of desire, they kind of have this framing that they set for themselves. But the object of desire normally has to kind of, how they romanticize things is as a person being chased by someone else, by a chaser of desire sort of thing. So in relation to that aphorism that was just said, it's that, women can frame themselves as the only way that they can kind of frame this desire, this natural sexual desire, is in relation, because they are most typically the receiver of it, is in relation to that perception. They kind of have to see themselves as objects being desired.
Yeah.
Because that's the way that, those sexual relationships work.
Yeah. Real quick, I'll insert this before I just found the aphorism. It's aphorism 311. But this thing about desire is like.
Oh hey, back to pity.
Yeah. This thing about desire is about how like. There's this desire. There's this desire to cease desiring, but many times, and I guess this fits in, and I guess Lacan works off from this, but it's like where if we were ever to attain this state of like complete rest, like this situation, this utopia where you're on the couch being fed like grapes by a robot arm, you would eventually like find reasons to disrupt that just for the sake of finding something to do.
Yeah, relationship is like, this is a very like nihilistic view of it, but the relationship is most interesting before it actually happens.
Yeah.
It's the chase of it.
Yeah, no, exactly. And like if there is like this cessation of desire, well, I mean, I guess Nietzsche would, I guess it would be like death for him. It's like there's no longer movement.
Because there's always the will.
Yeah. exactly.
You're just willing towards destruction.
He says this in an aphorism concerning the will. I think it's where he's talking about Schopenhauer. I think it's 127, but he's giving some conditions for what needs to happen. Yeah. Okay. Against him, I posit these propositions. First, for will to come into being, an idea of pleasure and displeasure is needed. Second, when a strong stimulus is experienced as pleasure or displeasure, this depends on the interpretation of the intellect, which, to be sure, generally does this work without rising to our consciousness. One and the same stimulus can be interpreted as pleasure or displeasure. Third, it is only in intellectual beings that pleasure, displeasure, and will are to be found. The vast majority of organisms has nothing of this sort. And, there's a little note here from Kaufman that says, eventually he'll say that will underlines like everything, whether or not it has, I guess intellectual, whatever. But, if there's no desire, well, there's no movement. There's an
interesting point where I think this is a Freudian division of the world, where there is a drive towards life and a drive towards death, right? The Eros and Thanatos, I think is what he calls it. And I think the point that Nietzsche's making here is that Schopenhauer views the world just as this striving towards life, right? And he sees it as this horrible thing, and so we need to try to stop that. But Nietzsche's point is that if you're not striving towards life, you're striving towards death instead. There's always this action of striving towards something that's occurring. And so Schopenhauer wants to achieve this stopping. He wants to stop going in this direction. But that once you are affirming that, you're just affirming a separate direction you're going in.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so like the will to power can either be affirmative or can be negative. And so it's always striving towards something, but it's striving to different things. But the section that I was referencing, section 311, refracted light, I note that this, to me, talked about a lot about like Nietzsche's psychology as he struggles to come to terms with his own philosophy, which is one of, a compassion without pity. Would you guys mind if I read this real quick?
Sure,
Okay.
And there is another section.
What section is this?
After that one.
311. Okay, and there's another one after this, Nicholas?
Yeah, and it's related to compassion as well.
Okay. So, refracted light. One is not always bold, and when one grows tired, then one of us, too, is apt to moan like this. It is so hard to hurt people. Oh, why is it necessary? Why does it profit us to live in seclusion when we refuse to keep... What does it profit us to live in seclusion when we refuse to keep to ourselves what gives offense? Would it not be more advisable to live in the swarm and to make up to individuals the sins that should and must be committed against all? To be foolish with fools, vain with the vain, and enthusiastic with enthusiasts. Wouldn't that be fair, given such overweening deviation on the whole? When I hear of the malice of others against me, isn't my first reaction one of satisfaction? Quite right. I seem to be saying to them, I am so ill attuned to you and have so much truth on my side that you might as well have a good day at my expense whenever you can. Here are my faults and blunders, here my delusions, my delusion, my bad taste, my confession, my tears, my vanity, my own owlish seclusion, my contradictions. Here you can laugh, then, and be merry. I do not resent the law and nature of things, according to which faults and blunders cause merriment. To be sure, times used to be more beautiful when anyone with a halfway new idea could still feel so indispensable that he would go out into the street and shout at everyone, Behold, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. I should not miss myself if I were not there. All of us are dispensable. But to repeat, that is not how we think when we are bold. Then we don't think of this. So, I mean, like, as I think that may have been a section of where he was like really immersed in talking about compassion, and I noted it's like this is where it's like a point in the book of where he's like, wait a second, I don't know. He comes to the full realization of what he's saying, and kind of like the psychological term that would be required to, I don't know, be a free spirit, I guess. And yeah, what was the section that you mentioned?
It's 338. I'm thinking about how to connect these two sections now.
Oh yeah, so I read that one.
So it's quite long. I'm just gonna read some passages I think are relevant to the topic of compassion. 338, the will to suffering and the compassionate. So Joey, you were asking before if we could have a compassion without pity.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is related to what happens when you have compassion with pity. So it starts, is it to your advantage to be above all compassionate? And is it to the advantage of the sufferers when you are so? That from which we suffer most, profoundly and personally, is almost incomprehensible and inaccessible to everyone else. And I'm skipping some parts here and there.
Okay, yeah.
Everywhere, however, where we are noticed as sufferers, our suffering is interpreted in a shallow way. It belongs to the nature of the emotion of pity to divest unfamiliar suffering of its properly personal character. Our benefactors lower our value and volition more than our enemies. Then I'm going to skip to another section. It reads, if you are unwilling to endure your own suffering even for an hour, and continually forestall all possible misfortune, if you regard suffering and pain generally as evil, as detestable, as deserving of annihilation, and as blots on existence, well, you have then, besides a religion of compassion, yet another religion in your heart, and this is perhaps the mother of the former, the religion of smug ease. And I'm gonna stop there.
Yeah. Yeah. Like this thing about compassion, it's like, what were you going to say, Will?
This actually goes back to the consciousness conversation because basically I think what he's saying here is that someone who's pitying is seeing that communicatable part of the suffering, whereas the depth of the suffering is the uncommunicatable part.
Yeah.
So when you're pitying, you're addressing all the parts that can be communicated and completely, just ignoring or denying all the uncommunicatable aspects of it.
Yeah. Yep. That's a good connection, but it's like the last part of aphorism 338 that you were talking about. It's like, okay, let me see if I can start.
So the last part kind of goes in a different direction, more on like what happens to the person who pities. So the first part was kind of like what happens to the pitied when you pity them. Second part is what happens to the person who pities, or why is he pitying? So like more about like the motivations of the pitier.
So like he says here, you will also wish to help, but only those whose distress understand entirely, because they share with you one suffering and one hope, your friends, and only the manner in which you help yourself. I want to make them bolder, more persevering, simpler, gayer. I want to teach them what is understood by so few today, least of all by these preachers of pity, to share not suffering, but joy. Yeah, the gay science, teach your friends to be gayer, guys.
So here's his motivations a bit with people who do pity. One he says is that they want to divert themselves from the goals they have and to the goals of others, which is also what happens when you pity. You start diverting yourself from your goal to alleviating the viewable suffering of others. And he even kind of talks about this might actually be the motivation, because it's hard to achieve your own goal. Sometimes people who sacrifice themselves for their country, it's easier to sacrifice for yourself for your country than it is to achieve whatever goal you're trying to do.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like he does say this thing of where I don't know, it's like if you, for the free spirit is kind of somebody who's like I don't know, they kind of separate themselves from the political issues of the day, because it's kind of like I don't know, the political issues are it's a lot of energy being burnt up, which and which a lot of people engage in. But like the free spirit is somebody who will go off and like do their own, whatever, they're kind of not concerned with the rest of what everybody's concerned with and burning so much energy for. They'll reserve that energy to do something, well, great. And I remember we were talking about this, Will, over the chat. We were talking, it was like, it was the sections of where he's talking about like workers in like bourgeois society and how, noble souls will they'll basically be bored. Like they'll be bored until like there's something worthwhile to do. Whereas workers, they have to work on something. They're burning energy in each and every direction. But it's burning fuel in no particular direction, really. Whereas like a noble spirit will pursue whatever, amorphity, whatever they're affirming or pushing in the direction.
It's actually kind of worse than that. Someone who is constantly busy with stuff is actually working towards someone else's goal. So someone who kind of just like refuses to work unless if it's something that they want to be doing, is someone who's working towards their own goal. And won't be going against their interests.
That's true. And you actually bring up a good point. You are kind of working for somebody else's direction. And so as I've been reading through Nietzsche here, I couldn't help but think of Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, and she's like, the great man is like the capitalist, somebody who is like, they're creating great projects and societies holding them back. It was very reminiscent of Nietzsche's own Noble Souls and Free Spirits. But the only difference between this is that Ayn Rand isn't aware of the fact that things are not neutral. There are different forces which are pushing you in different directions. And I guess capitalism would be one of those forces in which you're pulled in a certain direction. It can be very reactive. And so I think this would be like the big difference between like Nietzsche's like great man and like Ayn Rand's great man is that, capitalism is its own pull in a certain direction. And so to work with it, you're allowing yourself to be carried by another force going in another direction versus like Nietzsche's great man, which would be assertive on their own terms or whatever, on their own values. It's value creations aside from whatever the herd's creation of values and consciousness are. I think that would probably be a pretty good way to parse out like the major difference between these two great mans, because we know that like Nietzsche has been, you have your gym bros who will be like, I knew this one guy who liked to read Nietzsche like in the gym, and we see how he can be appropriated for like a lot of causes in which, his philosophy is not conducive in that way. And so I think it's really important to compare, Ayn Rand to Nietzsche and say, hey, these aren't the same values that you think they are. And so you should stop using them.
I've always thought one of the largest differences between the two was that Nietzsche is so individual that the blame fully falls on the individual, right? Any failure of self-actualization is the individual's failure. Meanwhile, Ayn Rand pretty much explicitly makes the argument that these great men already exist and that they're being held back by government regulation and things like that. But I don't think Nietzsche would ever blame the government for his own failing. If there's a failure, it's in the individual.
So Ayn Rand is like more political, whereas Nietzsche is like kind of apolitical in that he is just describing what individuals should be doing, not what society should be doing to allow for these individuals to exist.
Well, I don't think that he's apolitical. He has plenty to say about the socialists and anarchists and Christians and democracy. He has plenty to say on that. I know that I've heard that said sometimes where Nietzsche's this apolitical guy, but I don't think
Oh,
that's the
so
case.
Nietzsche is like explicitly against capitalists, though he has a lot of problems with them. He kind of compared like capitalists to like blood sucking dogs and stuff. He thinks like or like you look at the people and they're like so like before there were like nobles of noble birth, and you're like you respected the people that lorded over you. But now it's like but with capitalists it's like it was just happenstance that this guy happened to come across all this wealth. There's nothing like interesting or respectable about this dude. So why don't we throw the dice again with socialism?
Well, I think Nietzsche's explicitly anti-socialist.
Oh, he is, but I'm saying that's what the person thinks that's under the capitalist is
Yeah,
that
okay.
this person is completely doesn't have any interesting characteristics. There's no reason other than chance that he's there. Let's just try a chance again with socialism. But Nietzsche's not advocating for socialism. He's just saying
I see.
that that's why a lot of workers are going for socialism because they have no respect for capitalists.
I thought that was really interesting to know. It's like Nietzsche has this hierarchy of like nobility in his mind. He says that like the bosses in like a bourgeois society are vulgar. It's this vulgar sort of power that's being exerted over the workers, because whereas you have like like I don't know, Genghis Khan or whatever, like or like Napoleon maybe.
Oh, definitely Napoleon. He
Yeah,
loves
definitely Napoleon. But yeah, he does love Napoleon. But whereas like the boss, that's a vulgar. He happened to come across this power and picked it up. And I guess this kind of leads into like there's this idea of power as being like it's being the signs of it are like wealth and like all sorts of fame or whatever. But I don't think that that's a correct way of thinking of the power that he has in mind. In fact, I don't think it is, because when talking about like slave and master morality, he says that like slave morality has overcome or it has weakened master and master power.
Oh yeah, he said like overwhelmingly slave morality has won over master morality.
And so it can't be the fact that these signs, these displays of what we normally think of power are true power, because as it stands right now, slave valuation is still prevalent in Nietzsche's world. So it can't be the fact that these when somebody reads Nietzsche, they're like, okay, I'm going to become a Sigma. I'm going to be on my grind and collect all of these notions of power. But Nietzsche's like, actually, that may be a sign of like a lack of power.
Oh, when it comes to his lack of respect, did it kind of have to do with the kind of like more of the accidental aspect of it? Like, I mean, if the person who a person is accidental, but like, their power should be a result of their own struggles. But whereas like the bosses don't really have things to respect about them because their power came from inheriting money from their daddy.
Yeah.
I guess maybe that would be kind of part of it, but also I guess maybe the problem with like bosses as well is that they're also kind of like, rather than kind of being powerful, they're kind of just being controlled by the market and the decisions that they're making.
Right.
So it's not really that they don't really even
Yeah.
they're actually kind of manipulated as well.
Yeah, I think so. And let's see here. I think it was just last week, Will. You were talking about how Nietzsche he encourages kind of like this disdain, or he has kind
contempt.
of this contempt for. I mean, he really does. But do you happen to remember which sections those were that you were referring to? I knew you sent some pictures about the area of contempt.
Wait, actually, I don't know if I'll just look at what it says because it's I said the section on the thing, so I'll just find that.
Quick side note, I think it is a very important thing to say that Nietzsche is not advocating for master morality, right? Master morality and slave morality are both flawed systems. He's arguing for a new system, a transvaluation, right? Sometimes people think that Nietzsche definitely thinks master morality is superior to slave morality.
Yeah.
But ultimately, the point is to go beyond both of them.
And like he has this part about how, and I think just to characterize
Oh, found them.
just one second here, real quick, promise. Just to characterize that, it's like he compares like monotheism to polytheism, and it's like with monotheism, with polytheism, it's like you have all of these different sorts of gods that you've just like created, whereas with monotheism you have like I don't know, there's a central locus, that the world and everything orbits around. What were those sections, Will?
Oh yeah, I remember he also called the superstitious as more individualistic than the religious man. He kind of preferred them, and and polytheism was like a way of you being individualistic, but being like, no, it's not me, it's this God that's responsible. Yeah. So it was kind of a way of like justifying your egoism. Yeah. That's what polytheism allowed. Anyway, so the sections I was talking about before was 213 and 379. Those go into contempt. 213 is kind of funny. So I guess I'll just read it aloud.
All right. 213.
Oh, God, they skip a lot. Oh, that's because he just puts a shit ton of sections in this section.
Is that the way to happiness?
Yeah. So, a sage asked the fool about the way to happiness. The fool answered instantly as if he had merely been asked about the way to the nearest town. Admire yourself and live in the street. No, replied the sage, you are asking too much. It is quite sufficient to admire oneself. The fool shot back, but how can one constantly admire oneself without constantly feeling contempt? And since he said on the street, the point of living on the street is to feel all contempt for all those people on the street, and then you feel better about yourself in comparison to those people. Then the other one is, the other one is 379.
379.
No, yeah.
379.
That one's longer.
Let's see here. And that's the fool interprets.
Yes. So. Yeah. So he. Okay. So one thing is that he talks about like hatred for men, but and he says that like no, we higher people don't have hatred for men. We have contempt for men because hatred implies that we're equals. No, we have contempt for people. Because they're lower than us. So, like, he kind of takes issue with misanthropes for that reason.
Yeah, misanthropy versus contempt. Yeah, that's interesting.
This is something that Nietzsche kind of talks about a lot, which I'm kind of not sure if it's really. I think he kind of talks about rank a lot, like how there's like a higher and a lower. And then, like, I think he kind of says that, like, it kind of seems like a lot of what he's kind of says in some places that, like, well, you need to have this rank so that there's things, so that people can be positively evaluated. You have to have people that are negatively evaluated because the positive evaluation comes from the comparison of, like, a higher person to a lower person. And then the greater that distinction, the greater, like, the comparative value of that person is. Kind of like what I'm thinking, if he's saying something like that, I'm not really sure, like the worth of that. I may have lost my train of thought.
No, I mean, I realize, I think I know what you mean here. Deleuze actually talks about, like, Nietzsche's hierarchy here. He's like, in Nietzsche, the word hierarchy has two senses. It signifies, firstly, the difference between active and reactive forces, the superiority of active to reactive forces. Nietzsche can thus speak of an unalterable and innate order of rank and hierarchy, Beyond Good and Evil 263, and the problem of hierarchy is itself the problem of free spirits. But hierarchy also designates the triumph of reactive forces, the contagion of reactive forces, and the complex organization which results, where the weak have conquered, where the strong are contaminated, where the slave who has not stopped being a slave prevails over the master who has stopped being one. The reign of law and of virtue, and so I think that is where if one were if one were to like wonder have like a good way of imagining like Nietzsche's hierarchy, it's like it's to imagine these it's a hierarchy of valuations. Like I prefer the active forces, active values than to passive forces.
Oh, well, okay. So what I'm talking about is that when he's talking about the value of things, does he say like the value is in that relative value, and that there is value when there's that relative distinction, or does he or is that wrong reading of him? Because if that's the right reading of him, then I don't really see that as like, why would I care about having relative worth compared to other people? Sorry, I'm not reading. Okay, so like he's taking that like what's valuable is that comparative. I'm not exactly sure how to argue against that, but it seems kind of odd for sake of value that like what is valuable is being superior to other people, and like that requires other people to be inferior to you. So to have value, you have to have people that are inferior to you.
Yeah, and I think it ties more so that by having more value, it's that you have more will to power, right? You have more life in you. It's more life affirming sort of thing. I think that's kind of the
But well, like
combination.
what I mean is that not specifically that you have more. That is what's valuable. All that is valuable is the relative difference between you and your inferiors.
This man, going back to like this idea of like hierarchy forces, active versus reactive. This he characterizes the law and virtue as being this like triumph of like reactive reactive forces. He says somewhere that when in the gay science that when you want to study a culture, don't study like when you think about their laws, don't think about what they're affirming. Think about what they're reacting to, what they think, what they're bouncing off from, and saying, "Ooh, that's disgusting. Let's make a law in the opposite direction." You know, and this triumph of law and of virtues of reactive forces. I was telling you guys about this the other day on the group chat. Deleuze uses like this discussion between, I think his name is Callicles or something, and Socrates. Callicles is like wondering how you distinguish nature and law, and here, let me just read it out here. So he says, law in this sense expresses the triumph of the weak over the strong. Nietzsche adds, the triumph of reaction over action. Indeed, everything which separates a force is reactive, as is the state of a force separated from what it can do. Every force which goes to the limit of its power is, on the contrary, active. It is not a law that every force goes to the limit. It is even the opposite of law. And Socrates replies to Callicles that there is no way of distinguishing nature and law, for the weak can only prevail if, by banding together, they can form a stronger force than the strong. Law triumphs from the point of view of nature itself. Callicles does not complain of not having been understood. He begins again. The slave does not stop being a slave by being triumphant. When the weak triumph, it is not by forming a greater force, but by separating force from what it can do. Forces must not be compared abstractly. From the point of view of nature, concrete force is that which goes to its ultimate consequences, to the limit of power or desire. Socrates goes on to...
That's the Republic, right?
Possibly.
I think so,
Really?
from what I remember, yeah. Because that whole thing is what is justice.
Oh.
And Callicles goes on where he says that, like, you know, the barbarians are the most justest people because they're, you know, they have, whatever.
Yeah.
Their actions prove themselves.
Okay. And I don't know, this idea that there is this big discussion on Nietzsche and like nature, right? Nicholas, I wish I had brought this up last summer during the environmental ethics, because it's kind of something that I stumbled upon. It's like, you know, once the world is made into this garden, you know, it's no longer a wilderness. And it's like, I had this one point.
That's not gonna happen.
Yeah, I know. Right.
What's not gonna happen?
There's not gonna be like a big garden. It's gonna be a fucking wasteland.
Well, perhaps, but it's like I made this one point that the professor said he had wished I had expanded upon, which is like maybe that there's like this maybe there's this so far we've had all of these values which would like to like temper nature down to like into something that can be completely taken care of, and like I guess that would, using Nietzsche's like terminology, these would be like the triumph of like law over nature. But maybe there's some value into letting go, and I wish I had expanded upon that point there. But Nietzsche on nature and law, that's an interesting discussion, which I think if you were to bring that into like any environmental ethics class, it'd be like, we're supposed to...
I think this actually makes sense with when it comes to like his sense of like power. So like you don't really need to control something as much if you're stronger, because it can't hurt you. So like, you know, like if there's a cat, you know, you don't need to get rid of its claws, because what is it gonna fucking do? It's a cat. Yeah. You know, it's too small. Whereas, you know, but like, you know, if you're like a mouse, then like you probably want the cat to be like in a cage or something, because it could hurt you. So like, you know, if you're stronger, you don't really need to control other people as much, because they can't hurt you.
Yeah, it's interesting we're bringing up this discussion about nature, because this sounds a lot like Emerson.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Because Emerson has this whole thing about kind of finding yourself in nature, and that man is always kind of supposed to be, you're supposed to have this large kind of frontier and this large nature larger than yourself, because that's where you find yourself, not by like the influences of society sort of thing. If you're just being the influences of society, then you're not your own individual sort of thing.
Yeah, you heard it here first, folks. Go build a log cabin. Just don't be mailing anything you shouldn't, though.
I wonder if this relates. Is there like a thing where like if you were stronger, you wouldn't really feel like the need to control nature as much?
I think that
maybe it could be like, oh well, if lightning comes and strikes my house, I'll be able to deal with it. You know, my house can stand that shit. Yeah, or you know, maybe something like that.
I think that there's something you could work.
If there's a flood, you know, I have a fucking raft.
But let's see here. So, guys, God is dead. Says that first in section 108. I think that was 108 is like the first time that he says this. I think he's actually wondering about. I think that's like his intro into like. I mean, it touches on like the Schopenhauer being like the new Buddha of Europe. So, new struggles, section 108. After Buddha was dead, his shadow was still known for centuries in a cave, a tremendous, gruesome shadow. God is dead, da-da. But given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown. And we still have to vanquish his shadow too.
It reminds me of Plato's allegory of the cave. Maybe it's intentional, maybe not.
No, I mean, like, his entire thing about the... Oh, man.
And so he goes on to, in 109, to kind of justify this, I think. Yeah. So in 109, he's kind of trying to explain how, like, the universe isn't, like, some sort of, like, thought out construction that, you know, was serving some purpose or whatever. And that's like kind of an argument against God.
Yeah.
So that's what. So yeah, 108 is his declaration. 109 is his is like kind of his justification of his declaration that God is one of them. He has to do a lot.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned 109 because that's like the aphorism where he really like, you know, if any existentialist reads Nietzsche, they really find value in like some of these sentences. Like he says, "Let us beware of saying that there are laws in nature. There are only necessities. There is nobody who commands, nobody who obeys, nobody who trespasses. Once you know that there are no purposes, you also know that there is no accident. For it is only beside a world of purposes that the word accident has meaning. Let us beware of saying that death is opposed to life. The living is merely a type of what is dead, and a very rare type. So, yeah, if
Yeah, that's
That's
the
where the
thing. People say,
existentialist-
I don't know. Never mind. I don't know if this is actually a deep point, but whatever. A lot of people say like, our existence is merely an accident. It's like, no, it's not an accident at all, because an accident would presuppose that there was some sort of purpose for the universe and that we weren't a part of that. But no, the universe doesn't have a purpose at all.
Yeah.
So we weren't even an accident. There's nothing to,
the existentialist Nietzsche would be like, the affirmation of value. You shouldn't be trying to identify like your entire sense of being around like an external object. It's like, I'm a Christian. Like your entire identity surrounds a central focus. Whereas like once your identity, like once you realize this connection between you and the object is like dissolved, like he has this really cool aphorism that describes like now we're on like the infinite ocean. What are we going to do? Yeah, it's 124 in the horizon of the infinite. We have left the land and have embarked. We have burned our bridges behind us. Indeed, we have gone farther and destroyed the land behind us. Now, little ship, look out. Beside you is the ocean, to be sure. It does not always roar, and at times it lies spread out like silk and gold in reveries of graciousness. But hours will come when you realize that it is infinite, and that there is nothing more awesome than infinity. Oh, the poor bird that felt free and now strikes the walls of this cage. Woe, when you feel homesick for the land, as if it had offered more freedom, and there is no longer any land. And so, like, existentialist Nietzsche is like, okay, now one should be like brave to set out on this new course of there is no like external object with which you attach yourself forever, like for your entire life. You're now free to set sail on this infinite ocean of like creating values. And yes, it's scary, but if you have the affirmative will, then you'll be strong enough to stay on that ship.
An analogy I'm thinking to maybe clarify that idea would be that God, or maybe the belief in God, was the rock, the pillar, the unmovable thing you could always latch onto. When reality was too much, it was too scary because it was always changing. But now it's gone. Now you are not in the mountain, you're not in the rock, you are in the sea. And the sea is always flowing, always moving, and you're lost.
Nice. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that hits exactly it. But we can't miss section 125 here.
Are you aware that it's an illusion, by the way?
The illusion of what?
The 125, it's like a reference to a famous Greek story.
Oh, what's the story?
There's a story that Diogenes was going through Athens with a lantern, and he says, and people were asking him, it's like, what are you looking for? And he says, it's like, oh, citizens of Athens, I'm looking for an honest man. Can you tell me where I can find him?
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, cool. We have Diogenes in here. Freaking Diogenes. All right, but like 125 is where the madman, he's like hopping around. He's like, guys, don't you know that like God is dead? And you guys aren't freaked out at all or anything. And then when he realizes that the people aren't ready for him, like he smashes his lamp. At last he threw his lantern on the ground and it broke into pieces and went out. I have come too early, he said then. My time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars requires time. Deeds, though done, still require time to be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than the most distant stars. And yet they have done it themselves.
That's the interesting thing. So now I'm wondering, why is it an event that takes so much time for us to be aware of, even though we did it? Are we doing things we're not aware of?
I think Nietzsche kind of says that we're doing things we're unaware of a lot.
The unconscious.
Most of what we do we're completely unaware of.
It's like
Well, I think the point here is that it's superficial, right? It's a superficial belief in God. we still carry on as like an aesthetic thing because it carries some value.
Yeah.
But it's no longer, that's the point of making the analogy to Diogenes, right? Specifically, Athens, compared to a lot of ancient Greek cities, kind of held itself in high regard because they thought of themselves as the most virtuous people.
Okay.
And the point was that Diogenes was saying that it was superficial. You guys just say that you're honest and you're these great people, but it's just like these values that you're assigning to yourselves. And so the comparison here is supposed to be the same. That the people are still holding themselves as the believers in God. But because of this superficial way of believing in God, they've killed God as a structure and only kept it as an aesthetic.
The aesthetic. Yeah. Preservation. Yeah. Interesting. That is interesting. I mean, like, I know I've said this time and time again now, but it's like where the utilitarians will, like, they want to keep they get rid of like the content but keep the structure in their theory as they try to decide like what the good is, as kind of like this universal central point at which the world revolves. But like the point you bring up is like it's only like superficial aesthetics that they want to keep and that they preserve. It's interesting.
Yeah. I think there's a point, as I think it's like a Zizek lecture or something, where he mentions that like the ancient Greeks had this belief in Mount Olympus. And yet, do you really think that they thought that if they climbed up the mountain, they would find the gods there?
Yeah. But section 125, and then I didn't finish categorizing, unfortunately, but yeah, he talks about Schopenhauer's The New Buddha of Europe.
I have something different.
What's that?
Okay, so this is on our question mark, 346. This actually goes back to a previous discussion, which is man and world, but he laughs at this justification with the little word and. As though, like, you know, there's two different things. So, yeah, that's kind of, that was him talking about, I think, like how, you know, the world and man are like just the same thing. They're not some separate entity.
Let's see here. 346, you say? That's, it's not nearly, no, aha. Oh, no, this is actually, I think this is one of my favorite sections, or at least it's a starred one. It's
so
like,
this goes back, this is kind of like compared to our discussion we were just having earlier about kind of the connection between people and the external world, or how like that is actually just what a person,
yeah, I mean, well, I mean, I guess this section, this aphorism right here was just what I was talking about concerning the utilitarian, where he's like, it's like he says, if we simply called ourselves, using an old expression, godless or unbelievers or perhaps immoralists, we do not believe that this would even come close to designating us. We are all three in such an advanced stage that you, my curious friends, can never comprehend how we feel at this point. Ours is no longer the bitterness and passion of the person who has torn himself away and still feels compelled to turn his unbelief into a new belief and purpose, a martyrdom. Yeah, it's interesting because like they have to create a new religion after they've torn away from whatever they were attaching themselves to before. And it's like, I know that there was like this really famous New Age atheist who like recently became like a Christian. Again, I forget what her name is, but she was like really active with like the Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and what was his name? He's the author. We were just talking. Sam Harris, and he's the philosopher who just recently died. He did a lot on cognition and consciousness. Dennett, yeah. But she was really active in this crowd here. But recently, like, she converted back to Christianity because she was talking about modern values, and she's like, well, I have to believe in something. And it's like, I think that there's this like kind of, this really characterizes the point of where you know, when Nietzsche says, when we use this old expression, godless or unbelievers, perhaps immoralists, free thinkers, more times than not, it's usually this attempt to create this another belief system to attach yourself to. And like Deleuze talks about this. He's like,
I see this with like the atheist on like
Yeah.
YouTube is a lot of what was it like scientism? Oh, and anti-feminism for some reason. Yeah. Also, I'm not sure if the thing I found was actually that connected to the previous topic actually that we were talking about. Is I mean, other than that, like he was kind of saying that like he finds it ridiculous when people are talking about like finding a value like outside of the actual world. He's like, that's ridiculous because this is all there is.
right.
And like, you know, I think maybe he's saying part of the reason why they're even able to think about this is that because they think of like, you know, man and world as these separate things, or man against the world, whereas you know, a man is just part of the world. There's not two different things. It's just, you know, so you can't, you know, there isn't a man if the world isn't there, because the world is, you know, where the man is. Like,
And like, yeah, the identification with like an object rather than the subject themselves, like producing values and exerting them onto the world. And like, I this is like the point about like the New Age atheists. It's like they still want to find like an object to attach themselves to, and this is why Nietzsche is like saying you guys are still preserving the structure. But it's like I was saying like Deleuze. This is why like Nietzsche creates like, I guess it's like another inversion of where he creates free spirits versus like a free thinker. These so-called these, only 1 second here.
So, Will, even though it's not as much connected with how consciousness emerges and the relationship between people and the world, I think it's still relevant because now we're talking about belief, the power of belief, and maybe the power of unbelief.
Yeah, belief in the unbelief.
oh, so yeah, this is actually something that comes up quite often. Is that someone wants to break free of something, and then like they become the inversion a lot of the times, and then that's like so it's like inverse slavery. Okay, so let's say that you have contempt for society and the laws, so you decide you're going to break every single law that exists. Then it's like, well, now you're just, you're a slave, but in the reverse direction. You're doing the opposite of whatever people tell you. So like, you're not free. You're still controlled by them. Just
Yeah, it's reactive, and like this is something that I noticed when so the Satanic Church actually I think is a good idea of how it's this reaction to the church and how they create, they change the aesthetics and everything, but they still keep, they still think that there's like a value in the type of, they want to still preserve the moral structure, just in a different way with the content. Like,
so this isn't inverse slavery. Then this would be something different.
well, I think it's still like the slave morality. They're just still reactions. The reactions can still take place, but it's
Well, I mean more like what I mean is that like if they're carrying the same values, those aren't inversions of the same values.
Yeah.
So this would be a case of inverse slavery. Just
yeah. I don't think it's like a true like transvaluation of like what Nietzsche is trying to do in his.
well, reverse slavery isn't a transvaluation either. It's also just a reactive thing where
Yeah.
you're just. But this isn't even an inversion. They're actually they're keeping the core but changing the superficial details. The core of Christianity is the morality and moral rules, and then the superficialities are like the rituals and stuff. Right. So you can just change it to new rituals and then keep the core intact. You basically have the same thing. But yeah.
Yeah.
I guess it's like a more pure form of Christianity.
And he says, so like Deleuze says, I'll read this here real quick. The free thinker has the strange craze for recovering every content, everything positive, but without ever questioning the nature of these self-styled positives, or the origin or quality of the corresponding human forces. This is what Nietzsche calls fatalism. The free thinker wants to recover the content of religion, but never considers that religion might in fact contain man's basest forces, forces which we might want to leave behind. And skipping on down, Nietzsche opposes the free spirit to the free thinker, the spirit of interpretation itself, which judges forces from the standpoint of their origin and quality. He says, "There is no facts, nothing but interpretations." And I don't know, it's like you have this idea of like the atheist Redditor who, like, you know, he's going to destroy the opposition with facts and logic because, you know, Christians aren't, you know, they aren't talking about objective truth. I'm talking about objective truth. But
in a weird way, it's almost as if they're proclaiming to be the truer Christian.
yeah, no, seriously though. Maybe it's like a radicalization of, is it a radicalization of Christianity?
Yeah, it's like we're keeping the Torah. We don't need this superficial stuff. This is just an unnecessary add-on.
We are the true observers of the universe. We don't need these stories.
Right. And Nietzsche is only saying that there's interpretations. And
the core is the problem.
Exactly.
I want to read a section from The Gay Science that contrasts with what you just read about free spirits. Then I have a question about free spirits.
What section?
It's going to be the last part of section 347. Believers under need of belief. And the last section of that part starts with, when a man arrives... When a man arrives at the fundamental conviction that he requires to be commanded, he becomes a quote-unquote believer. Reversely, one could imagine a delight and a power of self-determining, and a freedom of will whereby a spirit could bid farewell to every belief, to every wish for certainty, accustomed as it would be to support itself on slender cords and possibilities, and to dance even on the verge of abysses. Mm-hmm. Such a spirit would be the free spirit par excellence. But in the part from Deleuze's book that you read, it was something like free spirits want to recover the content of religion?
So Deleuze here contrasts free thinkers to free spirits.
Oh.
Because where was I? Was it Rousseau who said free thinker? Was it?
I think so. The free spirit, and this is kind of where Nietzsche starts kind of using his own use of the term, was originally associated with Voltaire.
The French Enlightenment.
There you go. Yeah. And Nietzsche doesn't have nice things to say about the French Enlightenment.
Eventually, in Human Alter Human, he's pretty warm on them.
Oh, really?
Because it's a book dedicated to free spirits as a walk away from German Romanticism.
I see.
But then he kind of, even as a preface, he kind of corrects himself and says that this was almost too much in the other way.
But yeah, I mean, like we've talked so much about how like belief is this like identification. Nietzsche doesn't like identity very much. He always, things are in the process of going from here to there and from there to over here, constantly becoming. The only fact about the state of being in existence is that there is no being, it's becoming. And I guess that, I guess that's what Nietzsche is saying when he says like God is dead. Besides all of like the cultural and moral things that attach to that, he's also making like a metaphysical statement about, this death of being. And being is being, its cousin truth, and all sorts of these capital lettered words that philosophy has upheld until this time. He's saying
Yeah.
something
and
preferable.
It's important. God was first postulated as the unmoved mover,
Yeah.
right?
Uh-huh.
As that idea, as just like the first starting place, as the grounding for the logic and all of these other things. And I think Nietzsche's point is that like that assumption is, we can know for sure now, is dead. It's gone. There is no grounding.
Yeah. There's no longer an anchor, or at least if there is an anchor, it's not desirable to anchor yourself to that point. And by the way, in that same section, 347, he says, "For fanaticism is the only strength of the will that even the weak and insecure can be brought to attain, being a sort of hypnotism of the whole system of the senses and the intellect for the benefit of an excessive nourishment of a single point of view and feeling that henceforth becomes dominant," which the Christian calls his faith, which, by the way, would fit the idea of the fascist very well as well. Nietzsche's been like his sister. Like I believe it's not what the book The Will to Power is. It's like a whole bunch of like Nietzsche's.
It's a collection of Nietzsche's aphorisms. Some of them believed to have kind of also been edited. It's hard to say.
Yeah. I mean, like.
So is this kind of like desire for certainty? Is it kind of like maybe more like why someone who's weak would want that is because like uncertainty is like scary. Like if you're strong, you're going, well, it doesn't matter what happens, I'll punch it.
Well, I mean,
Whereas someone who's weak, wouldn't be able to because they can't punch things well.
Well, yeah, I believe so. I mean, amorpha T, let that embrace your fate. I mean, it's this jump into the fight instead of, shying away from it. I think so.
In like Eastern Orthodoxy, one of the big points is this kind of like uncertainty is one of the driving points towards religion, where because there's such uncertainty in reality, you submit yourself under religion so that you can have a grounding. It's like a common thing.
Yeah.
I think it's a Catholic thing too. I don't remember.
I just wanted to emphasize the points like, Nietzsche's, he was used by the Nazis in some of like, their fan fiction literature. And this is one of the points of where, if there's anybody who characterizes, if there's any political system that characterizes, like, the Christian anxiety to adhere yourself to a central locus point. I mean, ta-da, here we are. We have fascism, which is fanaticism, where it's a display of weakness, where it has to attach itself to blood, oil, or I guess oil, but blood, soil, and like the fatherland and everything.
Section 2 has stuff about certainty. And contempt.
Yeah.
The intellectual conscience.
Wait, did you say section 2?
Yeah. So, yeah.
Yep.
He's talking about having contempt for people who do not question the uncertainties of life. I think like the issue he's kind of saying is like well, I guess what he finds contemptible is that like people are just kind of believing things when they don't have good reason to do so. Like they haven't actually gotten sufficient justification, and like they're kind of just blindly accepting something. That's kind of what he takes issue with. I don't think he's saying that certainty is good or anything. He's just saying that like if you believe something and it's not a certainty, then we should that's a person we should feel contempt for.
Yeah, I mean, like, the intellectual conscience, it's, he's saying, like, yeah, there is lack of it. People want to be certain. In many places in the Gay Science and in Twilight of the Idols, he talks about how, like, certainty is kind of, like, we make sense of all of our experiences and because we want certainty. We want, like, a total map of the world and of where the world's heading. And so we create this map of certainty, and it's inflexible. You can't do anything with that. And even if we were to have like this complete map of certainty, it wouldn't be that interesting. So
this is a little bit different than what you're talking about here, though I think it doesn't go against it. In the intellectual conscience, I think he's more just talking about like that like certain people don't have a grounding, but they're acting as though they do. That's kind of the problem. So it's not like their great desire for certainty. The issue here is that like, you know, they have something and they believe it, but they don't have certain reasons to overthrow. So they're like, you know, you know, they don't have the intellectual conscience. You know, they're not really doing what they should do to be like, you know, someone who's, you know, actually uses their head.
They don't mean anything when they express the belief. It's just, okay, you expressed a belief, and that's it.
As for the map of certainty here, like section 51, just these few sentences, it's called truthfulness. I favor any skepsis, to which I may reply, let us try it. But I no longer wish to hear anything of all those things and questions that do not permit any experiment. This is the limit of my truthfulness, for their courage has lost its right. And like, yeah, I mean, like, if we knew the answer, it wouldn't be that interesting. If you knew how like your life was going to end, it's like, I don't know, there's no longer any spontaneity or anything. You know how it's going to go, and yeah, against certainty.
There are so many things with certainty. In one hand, it could be something like, if you believe in certainty or the certainty of some things, you're trying to constrain reality.
Yeah.
Like, this is what reality is, and it cannot be changed.
Yeah.
And we already know Nietzsche is for the flux of everything and nothing remaining. But Will also mentioned that, okay, maybe we fear uncertainty. I don't think that's the case, or at least not only that we fear uncertainty. And I disagree that with a map of certainty we can't do anything. I think we can do a lot of things with a map of certainty. One thing can be we are imposing our view of the world to other people.
Yeah.
Like the will or the power of certainty compels you
Yeah.
to do what I want you to do.
Uh-huh.
That can be one application.
That's true. Yeah. The way I was imagining, like when I say you can't do anything, it's like, I don't know, like say you were to draw a map of like this little plot of land, and like you've discovered like every single like blade of grass, all the hidey holes, like down to its most like to its atoms. You've like discovered everything. It's like, all right, what am I doing here now?
Yeah, so you discovered everything. Bravo.
Yeah.
Props to you. Okay, then
Yeah, then
nothing.
Right.
That's the thing, nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, certainty. Killer of exploration, but
Okay, so I think this is an important distinction to make. He does not. I think so. His issue is not with the desire for certainty. His issue is with thinking that you've achieved it. I think that's the issue. In like the intellectual conscience, he even says here, but what is good-heartedness, refinement, or genius to me when the person you wish has these virtues tolerates slack feelings, is faith and judgments, and when he does not account the desire for certainty as his inmost craving and deepest distress, as that which separates the higher human beings from the lower. So, like, yeah, I think he's saying that, like, you know, desiring certainty is actually something he praises. The problem is when you stop, like when you stop at a point. That's when he has a problem, because like you stop when you haven't achieved it.
But then it's an empty desire, because you're always gonna be desiring for it, and if you think you achieved it, it's not the case. So
Well, that's the problem he takes issue with, is when he thinks that you've achieved it. He's like saying, like, you know, like you look at this world with so many uncertainties and questions and stuff like that, and like, you know, most people are just, you know, like, this is how it is, and they go on with their life. They measure their scales. This is good and bad, blah 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 blah. Whereas, you know, instead of being like, no, I want to, I want to like have certain things. I want to know about these things that are questionable and stuff. Like, why is things like this and that? But instead of you're just like, well, things just are this way. You know, then you're just kind of saying, well, you know, just acting as though things are certain and that this is the way things are, rather than actually having a desire for certainty and understanding that you lack it.
I see.
So I think the problem is thinking that you have a certainty and just acting as though you do, and laughing at people who question question your ridiculous beliefs, rather than desiring to find some firmer ground.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that there will be firmer ground. He doesn't he definitely doesn't think there's firmer ground, but so like his main problem is the people that think they already have certainty. I think that's his problem.
Yeah.
Well, were there any other like sections that you guys wanted to go over? Was there anything?
I mentioned that Wagner thing before,
Yes.
where I think that oftentimes when people are reading about Nietzsche, they kind of hear about Wagner and they just think that he's this like anti-Semitic old musician guy, and they don't really understand the importance of what Wagner stood for. In that Wagner was one of the central figures of the German Romanicist movement, as well with Goethe and Schiller and Hess. He was a big part of this idea of this new art form, this new Germany that we're going to create, right? And during the 1848, it's a very important year in history. It's when all of these revolts spread throughout Europe. The German version of it, it was the Dresden Uprising. Wagner was like a celebrity who was supporting it. He was throwing grenades from rooftops at police officers.
Yeah.
Ultimately, and that leads to the Frankfurt Conference, which gets all of these different German lords together, and they all agree on this liberal, united German state. But then they offer it to the Prussian king, and he turns it down, saying that he wouldn't accept a crown from the gutter. And that just blows up the whole affair.
Yeah.
But then, importantly for Nietzsche, later, when the new German state happens, Wagner then writes odes to this new German state, odes to Christianity. And so he sees German Romanticism ultimately as unable to carry on the arts because it was always set to be tyrannized over. It wasn't strong enough in its own values. It would always just end up being co-signed back into authority. And so I think that Nietzsche's disagreement with Wagner is Nietzsche's disagreement with the idea that we can make this new art in any old system at all. If we are going to have a new art, if we're going to have a new way of the future, it needs to have these new values.
No, yeah, that's a really interesting point. I didn't know that about 1848 or so. I think he also he said he despised. I think he despised like the new German or state or something, or like Bismarck specifically. I think he.
Yeah, because it was a state and authority over culture was the idea.
I see.
He thinks that the German state makes no room for culture. It only makes room for more power of the state.
Yes. I wish I had studied that section in depth because it's not from Twilight. Interesting, but yeah, Nietzsche and German. Yeah, he says a bunch of things about like the German language, the German folk, like not being conducive to like the arts or something.
Yeah, ultimately, perhaps dramatically, he puts it down to like the German culture and language itself, which is a bit whatever. The German people are incapable of doing this.
Huh.
So much so that in his thing for like Nietzsche contra Wagner, he's like, this is a book for free spirits, not Germans.
I see. It's just, and you've been listening to Parson.
I have been listening to Wagner's music. I actually quite like it, but
I like opera, but like if I couldn't understand like that thing, how long is that thing?
it's like 4 hours.
4 hour opera.
I just kind of put it on in the background. That was the point. It's supposed to be dramatic, whatever.
Okay.
But that was just an ending note on Wagner, because I think sometimes people don't know what to do with Wagner. He just seems like an old anti-Semitic guy. And it's like, well, why does he matter?
Well, no, that was actually great knowledge. I didn't know that. No. But what do you guys think? You guys have anything pressing you'd like to get out?
I think we didn't talk a lot about Book 5, which I think is the best book by far.
It really is. It picks up in Book 5 for sure.
And we could talk about like every section in that book, but I don't think we should do that.
You're so right. I think like for the first I don't know, 3-4 books. In my opinion, picks up at book 4, but especially book 5. But like, he just in book 5 he really picks up like his prose, and I think everything that we've been discussing so far is what he says in book 5, but like he says it way better.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just like by that point, you definitely notice this change in his tempo, and like he's always polemical, but he definitely wraps it up and just like beautifully. He combines. Really. There's a lot of good in book 5 for sure. But was there like a specific aphorism that that you would like to expand upon?
Yes, I was thinking about two. I'm still looking for them. One of them is the will to truth being or concealing the will to death. And it asks the question similar to this one. It's like, why do people deceive each other? Why deceive or why not deceive? So let me look for that keyword.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of he has a lot of good ones. He's like science as a prejudice. There's he has a section on why we are no idealist. What is romanticism? And the hermit speaks. I think it was the end. I forget which book it was. The end of book 4, where it has that like the intro to Zarathustra. Book 5 is really great. The Wanderer speaks on the question of being understandable.
The deceived section is 344. I'm gonna read some sections of that. And this is not the beginning, it's a little after the beginning. So it says that science cannot exist without premises, so we are questioning whether truth is really necessary for that. And we ask ourselves, this absolute will to truth, what is it? Is it the will not to allow ourselves to be deceived? Is it the will not to deceive? But why not deceive? Why not allow oneself to be deceived? Not wishing to be deceived, is this really less injurious, less dangerous, less fatal than the will to truth? Will to truth, of truth at all costs, being continually demonstrated. Why wilt thou not deceive? Especially if it should seem, and it does seem, as if life were laid out with a view to appearance, with a view to error, deceit, dissimulation, delusion, self-delusion. Will to truth, that might be a concealed will to death. Thus the question, why is there science? Leads back to the moral problem. What in general is the purpose of morality, if life, nature, and history are non-moral? So, it's difficult to talk about any topic in isolation with this book because it's all interconnected. What's the purpose of science? Well, what's the purpose of morality? Now we have to critique morality, but in doing so, you also have to critique the will to truth. Okay, what's that? Is it the will to death? Maybe, I don't know, the will to nothing. And, okay, what do we do now if morality is destroyed or perspectivized? It's no longer this fixed thing. It's always changing.
Yeah. And I think this was exactly, I think 344, the one that we're on right now, how we too are still pious. It talks about, that was what I was mentioning earlier, about truth overcoming itself. And the question is like, well, we're using truth to be both like, trustful and mistrustful. And I think like for somebody who says, I don't know, a lot of times science is seen as this objective thing. It goes back to the thing about innocence. And it's like science too uses valuation, has this metaphysical valuation called truth. And well, once we do that, wonder what happens to the role of science, Science overcomes itself. let's see here. Yeah, but you will have gathered what I am driving at, namely that it is still a metaphysical faith upon which our faith in science rests. We godless anti-metaphysicians still take our fire, too, from the flame lit by a faith that is thousands of years old. That Christian faith, which was also the faith of Plato, that God is the truth, that truth is divine. And finally, we sacrifice God himself on the altar. What if God himself should prove to be our most endearing lie? Page 283. So, yeah, that's, science and its metaphysical assumptions. Very, very important. Truth.
In my personal opinion, little has changed from the time Nietzsche wrote Gay Science.
Really?
Yeah, because I think if we asked most people today, at least if you go to a college or university class, are you a moral realist or moral anti-realist? I think most people are going to say moral realist. And it goes... I read this in an aphorism of Gay Science before. It's, why is no one questioning morality? Or why is it taken for granted all the time?
Yeah.
I think that's still happening today.
Yeah. It's an interesting point. Yeah, I mean, a question about moral realism. I feel like a lot of the time people will say that this, they believe in this. I think I agree with you. It's just on one thing. It's where they'll profess to this moral anti-realism. They'll say the world is not black and white. There are so many colors in it. But yet they still want to commit themselves to moral realism.
That's another one. So a lot of people in college campuses, not elsewhere, like if you're not in college campuses, there's just going to be fucking Christians. But in college campuses, a lot of them are like moral relativists, which is, morality is true relative to your position. So it's kind of like...
I got you.
So it's kind of still like a form of moral realism, just that...
Yeah, it's
but that it's a relative thing rather than so still exists would be the point.
That's a good point.
Moral anti-realism has a few different types. Relativism was one of them, I guess. That would just be denying that it applies the same way to everyone. I think that would be the part of like the moral realism, not that it doesn't exist. The other, moral non-cognitivism. So there's moral non-cognitivism, moral error theory.
Cognitivism would be under moral realism, right?
Yeah, so moral cognitivism would be moral realism. Moral non-cognitivism would be more of the anti-realist. And then there's moral error theory, which is, that one is pretty fringe. That's the position. So like non-cognitivism is that like even asking, even like stating any sort of moral statement is, you're not, I think it's more like, I'll go with moral error theory. That one's easier. So moral error theory is just the position that people make a bunch of moral statements and they're all wrong. That's moral error theory. Whereas moral non-cognitivism would be like, they're not even actually making moral statements. It's not even a cognitive thing that you can do.
Interesting.
I was thinking about that. I think the non-cognitivism view might make more sense because I'm not really sure how you can move away from like the descriptive ways of saying things.
No, I'm glad you brought that up. I haven't heard of either of those two. Moral error theory or moral non-cognitive theory, you say?
So there's moral error theory, which I think there was some guy called like Mackey or something.
Mackey, yes.
And then there's moral non-cognitivism. That might be the right word.
Interesting.
Which is just so one is stating that people are actually making moral statements, but they're all wrong, and the other one is that they're not making moral statements. You can't even make one. It's just impossible.
Ooh, I read Mackey recently. I can't really remember moral error theory very well. I will say, if someone's interested in reading one of his works on error theory, it's really cumbersome to read, and it takes a lot of time to understand what he actually means with error theory.
Maybe it could be a topic in the future.
That is a thing. Morality in general, when you get into meta ethics, it's very hard to. I don't really know how to do it. You just gotta think like, what do people mean when they're saying good or bad?
Exactly.
I'm not even sure
So-
what they're meaning when they're saying that. Like, this thing is good and this thing is bad.
Let's bring it up to Nietzsche. So he's questioning that, like, people are saying this is good and this is bad, but like, what do you mean exactly? Do you mean anything when you're saying that?
Yeah. So like, people automatically say like, this is good, and then it's like, and then it's like, okay, what do you mean by it's good? You should do it. But then they're basically just saying, okay.
Well, why should I do it?
No. So like when this is basically so like someone says like this is good, and then they say you should do it, but that's basically just saying it is good, or the other way around. You can say you should do this. Why? It is good, which is basically saying you should do this because you should do this. Which again, like, what the hell does that even mean? What does it mean that you should do something? I'm not sure.
That I want you to do something because I have this idea, and I want you to do it because me.
Yeah, wanting that makes a bit more. Actually, that one also is weird. I'm not really sure what wanting is either. But yeah, so that's like so that's why I wouldn't go with moral error theory. I don't think you're even actually cognitively doing something that makes sense.
Well, guys, we are approaching the 2 hour and 21-minute mark here. So that was a good conversation. But if anybody has any suggestions for what our next topic should be, we're thinking about doing Kant next. But if we want to continue on Nietzsche
I
in the
think
future,
after this one, maybe we could just specifically do like the meta ethics thing, because that seems like
pretty interesting.
that's something I've been very interested in and haven't really made much headway in.
But thanks for coming, everybody, and thanks for listening in. Anybody out there, we appreciate it, and we'll catch you next time.